Christmas Eve, the city blanketed in fresh snow. Nadia Grant, 30-year-old CEO, stood alone in her penthouse apartment, looking down at the glittering streets below. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone except her. She grabbed her coat, walked out. The 24-hour diner on the corner was nearly empty. She sat at the counter. Then the door opened. A man with a small girl, both shivering, stepped inside. The girl's eyes lit up at the Christmas lights. The man counted change in his palm, worry creasing his face. Nadia's carefully planned lonely evening was about to change forever. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching this from. Now let's start. Nadia Grant had built her technology empire through strategic thinking that prioritized efficiency over emotion, measuring success by quarterly earnings and market dominance, rather than the messy human connections that complicated optimal decision-making. At 30 years old, she commanded respect in boardrooms and industry conferences. Her reputation for brilliance matched only by her emotional distance from everyone who worked for or with her. Christmas Eve found her exactly where she'd spent the previous 5 holidays since her company's founding, alone in her penthouse with expensive wine and financial reports. The seasonal celebrations happening throughout the city, feeling like theatrical performances she observed but never participated in. The decision to leave her apartment and venture into the snowy streets came from restlessness rather than genuine desire for human contact. Her carefully curated isolation suddenly feeling oppressive in ways it typically didn't, despite being her deliberate choice. She walked without particular destination through neighborhoods transformed by holiday decorations, families visible through windows gathering for traditions that Nadia had abandoned years ago when professional ambition consumed every aspect of her life and left no space for the kind of sentimental connections that Christmas supposedly celebrated. The 24-hour diner occupied a corner that Nadia passed daily on her way to the office but had never entered. The modest establishment serving exactly the kind of ordinary working-class clientele she typically avoided in favor of upscale restaurants where business deals happened over expensive meals. But something about the warm lights visible through steamed windows and the promise of simple human activity drew her inside, despite knowing she'd be conspicuously out of place in her designer coat among people who clearly celebrated Christmas differently than wealthy executives isolated in penthouse apartments. The diner was nearly empty, just a tired waitress restocking coffee supplies, and an elderly man nursing what appeared to be his third cup while reading a newspaper. Nadia settled at the counter with coffee she didn't particularly want, her presence in this space feeling performative rather than genuine, like she was playing at being a regular person seeking comfort in ordinary places during lonely holiday evening. The door opened with blast of cold air and jingle of bells someone had hung for seasonal decoration, admitting a man and small girl who both looked half frozen despite their winter coats that had clearly seen better days. The man was perhaps early 30s, exhaustion evident in his face and posture, while the girl appeared to be around 5 or 6 years old, her eyes widening with delight at the Christmas lights strung somewhat haphazardly around the diner's interior. "Daddy, look!" the girl exclaimed, pointing at the decorations with enthusiasm that suggested such simple displays represented magical wonderland rather than modest attempt at holiday spirit in working-class establishment. "They have Christmas here too. Santa knows about this place." The man smiled despite his obvious fatigue, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. "He knows about everywhere, sweetheart," he assured her gently. "That's his job, remembering all the places where good kids live." Nadia found herself watching them with unexpected interest, noting the way the man carefully counted change in his palm while studying the menu board, clearly calculating whether he had enough money to order food for both himself and his daughter, or if he'd need to prioritize her meal over his own. The girl seemed oblivious to any financial concerns, chattering happily about Santa and presents, and all the Christmas magic she believed was happening throughout the city on this special night. "Can I help you folks?" the waitress asked, approaching with coffee pot and weary smile that suggested she'd been working since early morning and still had hours before her shift ended. The man's hesitation was visible, his jaw working as he apparently tried to formulate order that would satisfy his daughter while staying within whatever budget he'd calculated. "Just hot chocolate for my daughter," he said finally, his tone carrying resignation about sacrificing his own meal. "And maybe some toast if that's not too expensive." The girl looked up at her father with concern that suggested she understood more about their financial situation than he probably wanted her to comprehend. "Aren't you hungry, Daddy?" she asked quietly. "You didn't eat lunch either." Nadia felt something twist in her chest at the exchange. Recognition that while she'd been sitting in her expensive apartment, feeling sorry for herself about voluntary isolation, there were people in this city struggling with actual hardship, fathers prioritizing their children's basic needs over their own sustenance, families for whom Christmas represented not just lack of celebration, but genuine difficulty affording even modest meals. Before conscious decision could intervene, Nadia found herself speaking up from her position at the counter. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the waitress while gesturing toward the man and his daughter. "Whatever they order, put it on my bill, and add a full meal for both of them, please. It's Christmas Eve, everyone should eat properly." The man turned to look at Nadia with expression mixing surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been pride-wounded embarrassment about accepting charity from stranger, inexpensive coat. "That's very kind," he said carefully, "but we're fine. I can pay for our order." "I'm sure you can," Nadia replied, her tone gentler than her usual business communications. "But humor me. It's Christmas Eve and I'm spending it alone. And buying dinner for you and your daughter makes me feel slightly less pathetic about that choice. Consider it mutually beneficial arrangement rather than charity." The girl tugged on her father's sleeve, her whispered conversation apparently advocating for acceptance of the offer, despite whatever reservations he had about taking help from strangers. Finally, he nodded with slight smile that transformed his exhausted face into something approaching warmth. "Thank you," he said simply. "I'm Ethan, and this is my daughter Ruby. We appreciate your generosity more than you probably realize." What began as simple act of paying for a meal evolved into actual conversation when Ruby insisted that the nice lady should join them at their booth, rather than sitting alone at the counter on Christmas Eve. Her child's directness cutting through adult awkwardness about appropriate boundaries between strangers. Ethan looked uncertain about his daughter's invitation, but didn't countermand it, apparently recognizing that Ruby's instincts about human connection often proved wiser than his own careful maintenance of barriers. "I'm Nadia," she introduced herself while sliding into the booth across from Ethan and Ruby, omitting her last name and company affiliation, because something about this encounter felt precious in its anonymity, like she could be just a person rather than a CEO for these few hours. "And I meant what I said about being alone tonight, so your daughter is actually doing me a favor by inviting me to join you." Ruby studied Nadia with the kind of direct assessment that children employed before learning to hide their evaluations behind polite social conventions. "Why are you alone on Christmas?" she asked with innocent bluntness. "Don't you have family or friends who want to spend time with you?" "Ruby," Ethan said gently, clearly recognizing that his daughter's question crossed into territory that adults typically navigated more carefully. "That's personal information that Nadia might not want to discuss with people she just met." "It's okay," Nadia assured him, finding herself oddly willing to be honest with this child and her father, despite years of practice at maintaining careful privacy about anything personal. "I don't have family nearby, and I've spent so much time building my career that I never really made close friends who'd want to spend holidays with me. So I end up alone on nights like this, which is mostly my own fault for prioritizing work over relationships." Ruby's expression showed concern that seemed disproportionate to her young age, her emotional intelligence apparently highly developed, despite her circumstances. "That sounds lonely," she observed with devastating simplicity. "Daddy says Christmas is about being with people you love, not about being alone, even if you have lots of money for presents." The wisdom in that childish statement made Nadia's chest tight with recognition that this little girl understood something fundamental about life that Nadia had apparently forgotten or deliberately ignored in her pursuit of professional success. She had money for any present she might want, resources to create elaborate celebrations if she chose, but none of that could manufacture the genuine human connection that made holidays meaningful rather than just expensive performances of seasonal sentiment. "Your daughter is very wise," Nadia told Ethan, her voice carrying more emotion than she typically allowed in conversation with strangers. "She's absolutely right that being alone with money isn't actually better than being together with people who care about you." Ethan's smile was warm, despite the exhaustion still evident in his face. "She's the wisest person I know," he agreed, his hand resting on Ruby's shoulder with obvious affection. Keeps me grounded when life gets overwhelming, reminds me what actually matters when I'm tempted to get caught up in stress about things that won't seem important 5 years from now. The conversation evolved naturally into Ethan explaining about his circumstances, the single fatherhood that had started 3 years ago when Ruby's mother had left them both without warning or explanation, simply disappearing one day and never returning, despite his attempts to locate her and understand what had driven her away. He worked as building superintendent, the position providing modest salary plus apartment in the building he maintained, enough to support them both if he was careful about expenses, but leaving no margin for unexpected costs or holiday extravagances. We were on our way home from Ruby's school Christmas program, Ethan explained, his tone suggesting this was preface to explaining why they'd ended up in the diner on Christmas Eve rather than celebrating at home. But when we got there, the building had lost power due to some issue with the electrical system that I'll need to address tomorrow when I can actually see what I'm doing. So we're just killing time until the power comes back on, staying somewhere warm instead of sitting in a dark, cold apartment. The revelation about their circumstances made Nadia's heart ache with recognition that her problems about voluntary isolation were dramatically different from the actual hardship this family faced, spending Christmas Eve displaced from their home because of building maintenance issues that would presumably require Ethan's labor to resolve, despite it being a holiday when most people rested and celebrated with loved ones. That sounds incredibly difficult, Nadia said honestly. Christmas Eve is supposed to be about rest and celebration, not about dealing with building emergencies and waiting in diners for power to be restored so you can return to a home that will still be cold until the heating system catches up. Ruby had been quietly working on drawing that the waitress had provided along with crayons, apparently creating Christmas-themed artwork while the adults talked. She looked up suddenly with expression of determination that suggested she'd made some kind of decision. "You should come celebrate with us," she announced to Nadia. "When the power comes back on, you should come to our apartment and have Christmas with us instead of being alone. Daddy makes really good hot chocolate, and we have a small tree with lights, and it would be better if you were there instead of by yourself." Ethan looked mortified by his daughter's invitation, clearly torn between wanting to honor her generous instincts and recognizing that inviting wealthy stranger to their modest apartment might be inappropriate or uncomfortable for everyone involved. "Ruby, Nadia probably has her own plans," he said gently. "We can't just invite people we barely know to spend Christmas with us." "Why not?" Ruby challenged with child's logic. "She bought us dinner because she's nice, and we should be nice back by making sure she's not alone on Christmas. That's what Grandma would say we should do if she was still here." The mention of grandmother, who was apparently no longer living, added another layer of loss to this family's story, suggestion that they'd experienced multiple significant departures that had left just the two of them navigating life together. Nadia felt tears threatening despite her usual careful control of emotions, moved by Ruby's innocent generosity and Ethan's obvious devotion to his daughter, despite circumstances that would overwhelm many people. "I would love that," Nadia heard herself saying before rational analysis could prevent the acceptance. "If you're sure it's not an imposition, I'd be honored to spend Christmas with you both rather than returning to my empty apartment. Do you believe that sometimes people who appear outside our plans are gifts life sends exactly when we need them most?" Leave a comment below. The power returned to Ethan's building several hours later, their time in the diner having filled with conversation that revealed unexpected commonalities despite their dramatically different circumstances. Nadia learned about Ethan's dreams of becoming an architect before life circumstances had redirected him toward building maintenance. His passion for design still evident in the way he talked about structures and spaces, even though his work now involved fixing broken systems rather than creating new ones. Ruby shared elaborate stories about school and friends and her belief in Christmas magic that existed independently of material presents or elaborate celebrations. Walking through snowy streets toward Ethan's building, Nadia felt something shift in her understanding of what constituted meaningful existence. The penthouse apartment she'd left hours ago suddenly seemed less impressive than Ethan's modest home and working-class neighborhood, her expensive possessions feeling hollow compared to the genuine connection she'd experienced during impromptu Christmas Eve dinner with strangers who'd somehow become important in the span of a single evening. The apartment was small but obviously cared for. Ethan's maintenance skills evident in the thoughtful repairs and improvements he'd made despite limited resources. The Christmas tree Ruby had mentioned stood in corner of the living room, modest in size but decorated with obvious love, handmade ornaments mixing with a few store-bought pieces to create display that represented their combined efforts, rather than professional decorators' expensive vision. "It's not much," Ethan said, clearly self-conscious about having Nadia in space that was so different from what he assumed her usual environments looked like. "But it's warm and dry and it's home for us." "It's perfect," Nadia replied honestly, meaning it in ways she couldn't quite articulate but felt deeply. "It feels like a home rather than just a place to sleep between work obligations. That's something I haven't experienced in years despite having much larger and more expensive space." Ruby immediately took charge of the evening's activities, directing both adults in her vision for proper Christmas celebration that included hot chocolate made with careful attention to marshmallow to liquid ratio, Christmas carols played from scratchy radio that Ethan had apparently repaired multiple times, and story time where she insisted Nadia read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas, because your voice sounds like a teacher, and teachers are good at reading. Soccer to you." Watching Ruby's delight in these simple traditions, Nadia felt years of careful emotional armor beginning to crack. She had convinced herself that professional success was sufficient compensation for the isolation she'd chosen, that wealth and power created life worth living even without the messy complications of genuine human relationships. But sitting in this modest apartment with father and daughter, who had so little materially but so much in terms of love and connection, Nadia recognized how thoroughly she'd been lying to herself about what made life meaningful. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," Nadia said during a quiet moment when Ruby had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by excitement and the lateness of the hour. "I haven't felt this connected to another person, let alone to actual sense of holiday spirit, in longer than I can remember. You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing." Ethan smiled, his expression showing warmth that went beyond just polite acknowledgement of her gratitude. "Ruby has a gift for seeing what people need," he said quietly. "She insisted we invite you not because she felt sorry for you, but because she genuinely wanted your company. Thought you seemed lonely in ways that money couldn't fix. She's usually right about such things, has emotional intelligence that makes her remarkably perceptive for a 5-year-old. The conversation evolved into more personal territory as the evening deepened, both of them sharing vulnerabilities they typically kept carefully guarded. Nadia talked about the loneliness that came from success that impressed people professionally while leaving her isolated personally. The way her single-minded focus on building her company had come at cost of every other aspect of life that might have made that success feel worthwhile. Ethan described his own struggles with single parenthood and modest income that limited his ability to provide Ruby with all the opportunities he wished he could offer. The constant balance between being present for his daughter and working enough to support them both adequately. "You're an excellent father," Nadia said with conviction that came from observing his interactions with Ruby throughout the evening. "She's happy and secure and obviously loves you completely. That's worth more than any expensive toy or elaborate vacation you might provide if you had different resources. You're giving her exactly what she needs most, which is your presence and love and stability." "That's generous of you to say," Ethan replied, his voice carrying emotion that suggested he needed to hear such affirmation more than he probably acknowledged even to himself. "Most days I feel like I'm barely managing, like I'm one unexpected expense or emergency away from everything falling apart. But then Ruby does something that reminds me she's turning out okay despite our circumstances, and I think maybe I'm not completely failing at this parenting thing." Nadia found herself moving closer to where Ethan sat, their proximity feeling natural rather than presumptuous despite how recently they'd met. "You're not failing at anything," she assured him. "You're succeeding at what actually matters, which is raising a child who's kind and thoughtful and capable of seeing when others need connection, even if they're too proud or isolated to ask for it directly." The moment stretched between them, awareness building that something was developing beyond just seasonal kindness or temporary connection between strangers thrown together by circumstance. When Ethan's hand found hers, the touch felt significant rather than casual. Acknowledgement that what had begun as simple act of buying dinner had somehow evolved into something that neither had anticipated but both seemed willing to explore. I know this is unexpected, Ethan said carefully, his words choosing themselves slowly as though he was navigating unfamiliar territory. We met only hours ago under random circumstances, and normally I'd be much more cautious about developing feelings for someone I barely know. But something about tonight feels different, like maybe we were supposed to meet exactly this way so that both of us would be open to connection we'd otherwise have carefully avoided. I feel it too, Nadia admitted, vulnerability making her voice shake slightly, despite years of practice at maintaining professional composure. I came to that diner trying to escape my own loneliness, and instead I found you and Ruby and this entire evening that's shown me what I've been missing by choosing isolation over the messy complications of genuine human relationships. If you believe that true love doesn't need conditions, only courage, subscribe to Solo Parent Stories for more heart-touching stories like this. Christmas morning arrived with Ruby's excited wake-up call, the little girl apparently having forgotten that they had guests who might not appreciate being roused at dawn by 5-year-old's enthusiasm about Santa's visit. Nadia had fallen asleep on the couch after their late-night conversation, Ethan having insisted she stay, rather than attempting to return to her apartment in the early morning hours when the streets would be empty and potentially unsafe. "Miss Nadia, Santa came," Sharon, Ruby announced, bouncing into the living room with energy that suggested she'd been awake for some time, waiting for socially acceptable hour to share her excitement. "There are presents under the tree, and one of them has your name on it, even though you weren't supposed to be here." The revelation about a present labeled for Nadia made her sit up with confusion, certain that Ethan couldn't have prepared such a thing, given they'd met only yesterday, and he clearly didn't have resources for purchasing gifts for strangers, regardless of how meaningful their connection had been. Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking slightly embarrassed, his expression suggesting he knew exactly how the mysterious present had materialized. "Ruby wrapped one of her own presents for you," he explained quietly. "Apparently decided during the night that you needed something to open on Christmas morning, so she sacrificed one of the gifts I'd gotten for her. I tried to talk her out of it, but she was insistent that making sure you weren't left out was more important than having an extra toy for herself." Nadia felt tears streaming down her face before conscious awareness registered that she was crying, the gesture from a child who had so little choosing to share what she had because she thought it was the right thing to do, breaking through whatever remained of Nadia's emotional defenses. She had spent years accumulating wealth that could buy anything she wanted, but Ruby's simple generosity represented something no amount of money could purchase: genuine, selfless concern for another person's well-being. The present, when unwrapped, revealed a small stuffed unicorn that Ruby had apparently treasured enough to wrap carefully in slightly crumpled paper, decorated with child's crayon additions. "His name is Sparkle," Ruby explained seriously. "He's very good at making people feel better when they're sad. I think you need him more than I do right now because you've been lonely for a long time, and Sparkle is excellent at keeping people company." Nadia pulled Ruby into a hug that communicated everything she couldn't articulate through words: gratitude and affection, and recognition that this child had seen her more clearly in one evening than most people who'd known her for years ever managed. "Thank you," she whispered. "This is the most meaningful gift I've ever received. I'll take excellent care of Sparkle and think about you every time I see him." The rest of Christmas Day unfolded with simple activities that would have seemed boring to Nadia's usual sensibilities, but that somehow felt more satisfying than any expensive entertainment she typically pursued. They made breakfast together, Ruby directing operations with firm opinions about proper pancake-making techniques. They played board games that Ethan produced from closet, pieces slightly worn from obvious frequent use, but still functional enough for competition that made them all laugh despite its lack of sophistication. "I should probably go home at some point," Nadia said during lull in activities, the statement emerging with reluctance because she didn't actually want to leave this warm apartment and the family that had welcomed her so completely despite having every reason to maintain boundaries with stranger who'd inserted herself into their Christmas. "You've been incredibly generous with your time and space, but I shouldn't overstay my welcome." "You're not overstaying anything," Ethan assured her, his hand finding hers with gesture that had become natural over the course of their short but intense acquaintance. "Unless you have obligations elsewhere that require your presence, we'd love for you to stay. Ruby's already planning dinner menu and announcing that you have to help her build the blanket fort she's been begging me to construct for weeks." Nadia laughed, recognizing that she was being expertly manipulated by a 5-year-old who had apparently decided that acquiring a new adult friend was the best possible outcome of Christmas. I suppose my other plans can wait, she conceded, pulling out her phone to discover dozens of missed messages from her assistant, and board members apparently concerned that the CEO had gone silent on Christmas Day without explanation. Though I should probably let people know I'm alive before they send out search parties. The messages she eventually sent were deliberately vague about her location and activities, simply noting that she was spending Christmas with friends and would be unavailable until the following day. The responses ranged from confusion to mild concern, most people apparently unable to imagine their workaholic CEO having friends she'd spend holidays with, rather than using the time for strategic planning and business development. They seemed surprised, Ethan observed, having noticed Nadia's expression while reading responses to her messages. That you have friends and plans that don't involve your company. Do people really think you're that isolated? They think correctly, Nadia admitted. Until yesterday, I didn't have friends I'd spend Christmas with. I'd convinced myself that professional relationships were sufficient substitute for personal connections, that success and wealth compensated for the loneliness of spending every holiday alone. You and Ruby have shown me how wrong I was about what makes life worth living. 1 year after that Christmas Eve encounter in a modest diner, Nadia stood at the grand opening of the Grant Reed Community Center, the facility designed specifically to provide resources and support for single parents and their children who needed assistance navigating the challenges of raising families alone while working to maintain financial stability. Above the entrance, a plaque bore the inscription, "For those who once felt lost, may you always find your way home." Ethan stood beside her in the crowded lobby, 6-year-old Ruby bouncing excitedly on his other side. The little girl who had insisted that lonely CEO should join them for Christmas, now proudly wearing her special helper badge for the center's opening day. The transformation from that first chance meeting to this moment of shared achievement felt both impossible and inevitable. The year between filled with accumulated choices that had built family from connection. A reporter approached during the reception, her question directed at Nadia, but clearly meant to capture the human interest story behind the impressive facility. "What made you successful?" she asked, microphone extended to catch whatever inspirational soundbite the CEO might provide about determination and innovation. Nadia smiled, her hand finding Ethan's instinctively. "Someone once told me that true love is when you help others believe in themselves," she said, her voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "That real success isn't measured by wealth or company valuation, but by whether you help people become better versions of themselves." She turned to look directly at Ethan, her expression showing the accumulated love of a year together. "And he's the person who taught me that, who showed me through his devotion to Ruby and his willingness to welcome a stranger into their Christmas that wealth without connection is just expensive loneliness dressed up as success." Ruby, who had been listening with 6-year-olds' limited patience for adult speeches, chose that moment to interrupt with the kind of directness that had characterized her since their first meeting. "So now that you two have been remembering each other long enough," she announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "can you finally get married? Because everyone at school asks if Miss Nadia is my mom, and I keep saying almost, and it's getting confusing." The ballroom erupted in laughter, the tension of the formal event breaking under the weight of a child's impatient desire for clarity about her family structure. Nadia felt tears threatening despite the public setting, moved by Ruby's innocent advocacy and the recognition that this little girl wanted her to be officially part of their family. Ethan pulled both Nadia and Ruby close, his embrace encompassing the family they'd built from that single evening of connection. He looked at Nadia with expression that combined amusement and genuine emotion, his voice quiet enough that only she and Ruby could hear clearly. "She has a point," he said. "We've been living as family for a year now. Maybe it's time we made it official." Nadia's tears fell freely as she nodded, unable to form words through the emotion overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Ruby squeaked with delight, apparently interpreting the adult's embrace as confirmation that her campaign had finally succeeded. "Finally," Ruby declared to the crowd, still watching with obvious interest. "Now I can tell everyone at school that Miss Nadia is my real mom and Daddy isn't lonely anymore." The crowd applauded spontaneously, moved by witnessing genuine emotion rather than just another corporate event. The community center's opening would be remembered not just for its mission and impressive facility, but for the moment when its founder and the building superintendent, who taught her about what mattered, finally acknowledged publicly what everyone around them had recognized since that Christmas Eve. They stood together in that elegant space, three people who had found family through combination of loneliness, generosity, and child's wisdom about what Christmas should mean. The plaque above the entrance about finding your way home felt less like inspirational message for center's clients and more like documentation of their own journey from isolated to connected, from that single Christmas Eve to this moment of acknowledging their commitment. Outside the center's tall windows, afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold, the kind of perfect moment that felt orchestrated by forces larger than simple chance. And in that crowded ballroom, Ethan held Nadia's hand tightly, while Ruby bounced between them with six-year-old certainty that she'd just witnessed the best possible ending to the story that had started with her, insisting a lonely stranger should join them for Christmas. If you believe that beautiful memories never fade, they just wait for the right moment to return, subscribe to Solo Parent Stories to hear more.